Should you get and build Gnosis? Short answer, probably yes. Long answer, this entire video.
噂に名高いロドスのドクターか。私のことはノーシスと呼んでくれ。作戦通りに行動するように。
Gnosis Edelweiss is a 6-star Hexa supporter from Keharag. Former Chief Technology Officer of Kowloon Commercial. After the events in Break the Ice event, he joined Rhodes Island as an operator via special agreement between two company, and is now active as a member of Rhodes Island Scientific Research Program. Gnosis is the 6-star Hexa, and the first male supporter in the game. His ability is all about inflicting fragile from his cold and frozen ability, and dealing a good amount of burst damage. So how can this cooler, and coolest operator help your gameplay? We will see. As a Hexa supporter, each of his attack is an arts damage, and has a pretty wide range. As for his general stats, for a range unit, he got a pretty solid defensive stats, especially the resistance. But he is in no way meant to be used as a bait. Have a decent DPS thanks to his attack damage and attack speed, which will further improved with his skill, and he has a cheap DP cost. Moving to his talents, his first talent. Each of Gnosis attack will inflict cold effect for 1 second. He can also inflict frozen if he attack enemy with cold effect again. Apply 25% fragile effect to cold enemies within range, and double the amount to frozen enemies within range. Because of his 1.6 second attack speed, he normally can't freeze enemy without skills, or any attack speed booster. As far as I know, cold can be inflicted to every enemy in the game, while frozen will stop the enemy from doing anything, and only few bosses who are immune to that. And after Break the Ice event, frozen can also decrease enemy resistance by -15. Thanks to each of his attack can apply cold, the fragile effect is very consistent. His fragile effect can be up to 54% to frozen enemies, which is currently the biggest fragile effect a single operator can inflict. But without his skills, he can only apply fragile effect for a short period of time. As for his second talent, 10 seconds after deployment, he and Kowloon trade operators will gain status resistance. A pretty useful permanent talent, especially since cold and frozen effect is the main obstacle in his debut event. And one thing you don't want is that Silver Ash getting those negative effect when using his skill 3. And this is his potentials upgrade. His talent enchantment is quite impactful, but overall he's fine without potentials. And currently, he doesn't have module. Moving to his skills, his first skill. His next attack will deals 2 hits, and deal critical damage. A simple skill but quite useful for starter. He can deal a good amount of arts damage, and add Elite 1, thanks to his talent. This skill means he will inflict frozen to enemy because of the 2 hits. Though if you unlocked his S2 or S3, there's not much reason to use his S1, as his other skills are more dependable for damage and debuffing. As for his second skill, Gnosis will deal some percentage of damage to all enemies in his range, while also inflict cold up to 4 seconds at M3. This skill can be charged. The charged effect will inflict additional layer of cold, which normally will resulting enemy in a frozen state. A simple skill but also powerful for AoE damage, crowd control and debuff. And most importantly, it's spammable, thanks to the cheap SP cost. And if you are fighting those who cannot be frozen, you can just cold them, which only need 6 SP. At M3 the SP cost of the skill is 6. Enemies will be cold or frozen for 4 seconds. And the enemies will only have 2 seconds before you hit them with the skill again. Last but not least, his third skill. Massively increases attack speed and attack to target simultaneously. Thanks to this, his attack are guaranteed to inflict frozen, as long as the enemies are not immune. The frozen enemies within range will remain frozen until the skill ends. When it ends, he will break the ice and deal massive amount of critical damage. and during the skill he will prioritize attacking unfrozen enemies. So no need to worry, he will ignore those who are unfrozen, especially if there's a beta. This skill has the combination of crowd control, debuffing and burst damage. If you want to use Gnosis for debuffing especially to bosses, use this skill, as this one has the longest frozen duration, and can also deal additional damage. Though this skill has a bigger SP compared to his other skills, so it's not spammable, not to mention it has a pretty short duration. So while the fragile effect he offers is the biggest one in the game, your operators have a shorter time to deal the damage. Also, if the enemies cannot be frozen, this skill cannot reach its full potential, as his 50% fragile won't active, and he cannot deal burst damage to those who are unfrozen. And for a consistent crowd control purpose, it's not very awesome. For skill masteries, go for his skill 3, as a unit that is meant to weaken to enemies. This skill is the best one to do that and can also deal high amount of burst. The M3 goal is to increase his burst damage and also decrease the SP cost. You can then mastery his skill 2, though it's unnecessary. The mastery of this skill looks impactful once it's on M3. The M3 will decrease the SP cost from 7 in level 7 to 6 in M3, and also increase the cold or frozen duration to 4 seconds. As for S1, there's not much to gain from mastery beside the increased damage. As for his base skills, when assigned in Control Center, every Karlan operator will increase moral recovery of all operators in Control Center. And with his ETA base skills, the Karlan trade operator who is assigned to Trading Post will lose -15% efficiency, but increase order limit by 6. Not really an amazing base skill, as this is too depending on Karlan operator, and you'll need J at his E1. So, will Gnosis become a good operator for your team? Gnosis is a solid debuffer, crowd control and burst unit, and is in the middle line between useful for general stages and hardcore content like CC. Among those who can inflict cold effect, he is the easiest one to inflict that. Not to mention the fragile effect he gives is the biggest one in the game. Besides that, the cold and frozen effect he inflicts is a very useful debuff. If you already have a solid DPS team, especially an arts damager, having Gnosis in your team will be very useful to take out even the strongest boss. Even if you don't have an arts damager, Gnosis can become a pseudo burst caster with his skill 3 or skill 2. But of course he also have a few weaknesses. Gnosis fragile effect ability depends on cold and frozen. While cold can be inflicted to anyone, there's few who cannot be frozen. So when fighting them, his fragile effect won't mean much. But overall he is a great debuffer unit to have. Those 50% fragile is really something you can't ignore. But I really recommend you get him if your main DPS unit are already built. Especially if you don't have any debuffer or damage multiplier 6 to like Suzerain. So grab your Orundum, we got Micheal Jackson to get ya. That should be all. Adios.